Okay, we're in the period of the Crusades, and in all ideas, it's not really a great period of history for anyone. I mean, this is really hated by Christians today. Muslims don't forget it. The Jews don't forget it. There were thousands of Jews that were murdered in this whole time period. The Muslims arrived Muhammad 570 to 632 AD. Two things that build out of this. After his death, the Sunnis and the Shiites. Most of you don't know there's a separation in Islam, and there's still a war between those people. The Sunnis are more the Saudis, the Shiites are more the Iranians. The Sunnis are more dedicated to disciples and elected leaders. The Shiites go the bloodline of the Prophet. They're more crazy. Now the age of the great cathedrals are there. The Crusaders, in the same sense with this whole new Roman Empire to a degree, you see the works of it. They're driven by religious fervor, by the love of adventure, by personal wealth, to expel the Muslims from the Holy Land. So, 1071, the Turks defeat and recapture the Eastern Empire. Constantine is pleased for the West to help. So the tale of Christian persecution on the peaceful pilgrims, all these tales begin to come back. In 1095, Alexis I, Eastern Empire, sends out an urgent appeal for help. Pope Urban II proclaims the First Crusade to regain the Holy Land. And again, this begins the rise of basically the new Roman Empire in expansion. In other words, they want the church to expand. They want the East and West to be united. This is the ideal. They want all the Muslim lands and beyond to be retaken. There's a lot of greed in this, a lot of pride. But he sends a crusade to regain the Holy Land. And the urge is to pick up the cross. You're fighting for both spiritual and material profit. And basically, he lured nobles and knights into the idea you're going to go do spiritual profit. There was basically absolution given to knights that went to the Holy Land. In other words, when you went, you had divine forgiveness forever. It's like a modern. It's like jihad, right? Like the only way you know you're going to Muslim heaven with all the virgins is to die in a jihad. Well, the knights had that too. That if they went to battle, that they were basically forgiven of all their sins. And so they went for that. They also went for wealth. They knew they could conquer kingdoms and pillage and rape and do all that. So there they go. God wills it. You ever see the Kingdom of Heaven? Great movie on this was Saladin. God wills it was the cry. They go. They grow and they kill Muslims, and those people don't forget, and they kill Jews. They went with a high calling, They went against Augustine teaching on war, because Augustine, remember, in the City of God, he taught the idea of church and state. And he also had in that combatant rules that you wouldn't rape and pillage the weak and innocents and civilians. They go against all that. They just do what they want to do. Highlight of the major crusades, the 11th century to the 13th century, 7 major crusades. Really only 4 we're talking about, I think. First Crusade by Urban is the most successful. They defeat the Turks, capture Jerusalem, create a feudal state basically on the Mediterranean along the eastern coast. 1147, that last two had survived basically. They're eastern on the Mediterranean to 1291. But 1147, Jerusalem again is attacked and is on the brink of destruction. Bernard, the mystic of Clairvaux, calls for the Second Crusade. And that crusade is probably the most famous one. Basically, that's not the one. The Third Crusade is. The Second Crusade basically gets all puffed up. In 2 years it fades away, nothing happens. There was a corruption over the money. And basically nothing happens with that. They start selling indulgences for raising money. And the beginning of indulgences starts to basically begin. For remission of sins, for different things, to get out of purgatory. The money begins to pour in. Saladin in 1187, Jerusalem falls. call for the Third Crusade. This is the most famous one. Frederick Barbarossa, Germany, goes. The Lionheart of England, Richard goes. Philip Augustus of France basically went, argued with the Lionheart. He goes home. Richard's probably the most famous one. Barbarossa drowned in, I think, Asia Minor someplace. I don't know why he drowned in, but he says he drowned. So Richard finally, agrees to a truce with Saladin. They have a 3-year truce, and Jerusalem is open for all. So again, that's the Third Crusade. The Fourth Crusade is the revival of Innocent III, and this one's a total disaster. They needed ships to get there, so they go to the Venetians, Venice. The Venetians kind of are plagued by pirates in the city of Zara, so they get them to sack the city, the Crusaders, before they'll take them because their rates and their charges are so high. They got them to do that. They also get them to sack Constantinople. And basically, nothing really happens. The Pope is furious because they really don't go and take the Holy Lands. So inevitably the Holy Lands fall to the Muslims. So this also really widens, like they ask for help and so they sack their city. This really widens the gap between the Eastern and the Western Church. The results of the holy cause of these crusades for 2 centuries of war, and they're not really too impressive. The purpose was to win the Holy Lands and check the advance of Islam and heal the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. All those failed. So the Crusades basically added up to a big zero, except personal gain, wealth for those that went. Some, most, a lot died too. So the whole thing was a miserable Iran Gulf War debacle, if you want to say a waste of money. At the end of it all. Pope-like cathedrals that built, they lusted after a unified church, so just like the Pope wanted his great cathedrals, his great empire, he lusted after the East-West unification and all these different things. And the Pope's message said 2 fundamental truths, that Christianity's highest satisfaction are never guaranteed by its possessions of special places. In other words, the church looked like, what if we have the Holy Lands, that's really going to give us some kind of satisfaction, some kind of spirituality, some kind of divine favor with God. That the Bible doesn't teach that about lands, right? Not at all. So they missed that. And they missed the point that the sword is never God's way to extend his kingdom. The church is in the Islamic jihad. God doesn't extend his kingdom with the sword. He doesn't use force, he uses influence. So the next chapter was chapter 20. It was the Nectar of Learning, and this is the beginning of the Gothic movement and the light and all these different things. But it's also the rise of universities. With these cathedrals and the reaching up to know God, the reaching down, you begin to have universities formed around cathedrals. The church becomes the center of basically knowledge and education. So they wanted to have these things basically to have the purpose to explain the light of God's revealed truth. So they didn't want to change the church fathers, but they wanted to explain and understand the revealed truth of what the church fathers were basically saying. So we have a period that was what's called scholasticism in this period, and at a twofold aim. The twofold aim of scholasticism in these universities was to reconcile Christian doctrine and human reason. And then the other one was to arrange the teaching of the church in an organized system. So Christianity's faith, again, is seen as fixed. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to begin explanations, a Q&A basically, in reason, to talk about the doctrines and to, look at their implications, what doctrines meant. We do that in rap every week. We talk about a message and we talk about what's it mean. How's it relevant for me? They started to think, basically. The Middle Ages were the illiterate age, Dark Ages, survival. When you're talking about survival, eating and shelter, you really don't think a lot about how much do I know? Can I read or write? It's more, do I have food on the table? Do I have shelter? This was the system they were in. And it's like that in third worlds today. Why are third worlds illiterate? Well, you know what? If you don't have any food and you don't have a place to live, right? You don't have clothes on your back, right? would education be on the top priority? How about if you were in a war? Are you thinking about going to school? I think I'll be an architect. Yeah. No, you're not. You're thinking about, like, we get blown up today. So just like the idea of peace and Pax Romana and them trying to bring, out of chaos, this whole era, as they started to do that, they started to be able to say, well, let's learn something about what the implications of all this stuff is. Let's go deeper into this. So they wanted to find out. So the idea was living in a studious manner, and eternal salvation was the aim of the medieval education. So they wanted to live in this educated manner, to be the scholar. Education for the Benedict monks used to be only for clergy and monks, so the church was the only one who was educated. And that in this period of the Dark Ages, you remember the monks, and they're with their pens and pencils, they're writing the Bible, they're writing doctrine, they're keeping the church, going with all this. They are the ones who know. Why do you think the Catholic Church so much is about, come to us, we know. Don't read the Bible. Well, for so much of the Catholic history, people couldn't read the Bible anyway. There was no Bibles to read. So who would you go? You'd go to people that were educated, right? This is like the whole conflict with the Dominicans, and like it'll go on to the Dominicans, but the monastic movement is, they were the ones more successful, and they had knowledge too, but they were more down with the poor. Rich people really didn't go with people down in the mud, but these people did. So the church is always back and forth with where they are as far as ministering, and we'll go into that. But they began in liberal arts. They began in teaching grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. There's the 7 basic liberal arts. I found out something I didn't know. Here, there's a lot I didn't know, but one was liberal arts. It comes out of the Roman culture, because what it meant was freedom, and really the only ones that learned under the Roman system were free men. So what it really means is free men. When we talk about liberal arts, we're talking about, this is from the Roman civilization, even before the Dark Ages, that free men learned. You had to be free to be able to think. So that's where the word liberal arts comes from. Even today, that's the background of it. There's books that went on, and I don't want to get into these for times, from the Roman civilization about learning on the sacred and secular level, defining books on the bottle. Boniface comes into this, philosophy, authorities, going into Augustine, all these. So there's all this learning going back and forth from past, present, and going forward. The second portion, this was the magnetism of able teachers. Gilbert of Rheims Cathedral School began to be a great scholar at this time. He was exposed to Muslim culture, so he started to bring in all the ideas of different philosophies. He went into Spain for a position. He was exposed to Islamic thought. Islamic thought at that time was way more open to thinking than Latin thought. Latin thought was very rigid. You stayed right here. You didn't ask questions. Now Islamic thinking is like that in the most part. When you think of the Shiites, they're very like that. Don't ask any questions. I remember Shabeli's story of the guy that got converted to Morocco as an underground church when he went to the mullah, and he asked him 2 questions, and he said, you know what? Why do my daughters, they're not mentioned in the Torah, basically, in the future. I love my daughters. And he looked at him and said, don't ask stupid questions. And then he said, okay, I got one more stupid question. Question, I hope it's not stupid. We're to live this really, really pure life here. We're not supposed to drink and be perverse. But I read when we go to heaven, it's just wine, women, and song. We can do all those things. How come? And he looked at him again and said, don't ask any stupid question. Then he read the New Testament and knew Jesus was God and Islam was, false. And he got converted and he pastors an underground church today. But what I'm saying, it was a closed system. You see what I mean? Yeah. The Catholic Church was a closed system. He didn't go against established law unless you wanted to pay a consequence for it and be called a heretic and then excommunicated or worse. But Gilbert began to be inquisitive and ask questions. Peter Arland in 1079, 1142, he begins like this. He writes a treatise, yes or no, doubt and questioning. He looks into the Greek side of this whole thing in medieval Europe and philosophers. And students love this. People like open minds. People flock to him. He's put out of a monastery for heresy because of the same way asking questions. He's put in seclusion. But people still come to him. He's out in seclusion, like they exile. All these people know they want to go learn. They all go out to where he is in seclusion and say, hey, teach us. So this thing starts to spread all around Europe, and universities after his death sprout up all over the place and becomes more open because you can't thwart the human mind. People want to ask questions. They want to know things. So he had Q&A, and this was the Arlard method, basically. So scholasticism developed into a painstaking arrival of logic, conclusions, and questioning, examining, and arranging details into a system of logic. So this happened in the Middle Ages, in the universities. And there were wars, like people the same way, pride, people, there were wars, between one guy's thought, one guy's university and other people, I think it's this way, and then somebody would say that way, and, they'd have feuds over it, and they'd hate each other, and, defame someone. So this was all over the Middle Ages. They went into guilds, they formulated trade schools, they had guilds, they went into guilds for protection and mutual interest. So they wanted protection, they owned guilds, and they get support from noblemen. To protect them sometimes, if some bishop wanted to say you're a heretic, they would have some kind of influential protection. I'm in a guild, man, leave me alone, I know so-and-so. And they wanted that, they needed that. They also wanted the support of the papal monarchy. I mean, they wanted that. And, the Pope was always watching these things for heresy. He always had somebody in there. There was always somebody in the university that was watching out what was teaching. And so, you had a short leash in your knowledge at this time period.
Too bad they don't do that today.
Yeah, they lost that. We've gone to the other extreme. You can make any heresy you want and believe it, right? So, they wanted to make sure all philosophical framework was supported by the papacy. Civil law and canon law became the two main things of the university. Canon law really strengthened the papacy. It defined the duties of the people and the priests in the church, and the canon law administrated the ecclesiastical courts from the bishops to the pope. It gave them the power to interfere in wars. It did good things. It took care of widows at times. He could declare fasting and all these feasts and confession. And then he had excommunication procedures. So all these became under canon law. And canon law became as strong as any civil law. And even stronger in some ways. Because you know what? I could kill you in civil law. I could damn you to eternal hell in canon law. So who had the bigger gun? It became who has the bigger gun. Your gun doesn't look real, but the question is it really real? Your sword looks really real, but, what's more real? My canon law, which can damn you to hell. Jesus said, right, don't fear him who can kill the body, but he that can throw both body and soul into what? Hell. So based on Jesus, canon law had more power. The question is if canon law came from Jesus or not. That's the real question. So, they extended this whole thing, and they wanted control of the most intimate relationship. They wanted about the birth, the baptism, marriage, adultery, penance. They wanted to control zeal. They wanted to reduce the freedoms. Basically, this is complete legalism. Instead of the freedom that Christ had being under the true faith, they want to take over anything about freedom. So canon law gave the papacy these regional legal basis that the medieval state didn't have. So the papacy under Innocence rises to this tremendous power in life in feudal kingdom Europe. So they wanted to have complete, they didn't want to understand, they wanted complete control of the canon law, not just of the bishops, but they wanted to be able to come into your own personal life. Of regular people. And they wanted to know, sorry, I'm going offside. They wanted to know, you were getting married, you were having a baby, baptism, doctrines of limbo come out of the church, right? I mean, they wanted you to submit to them in anything you did. It was a church issue. Any social sin that you committed came to a what? Church issue. And that came with money, like you needed to be forgiven. Right? So if you needed to be forgiven, there was usually a penance and a lot of times a fee with that. So you can see these people like really milked you, man. I mean, they took anything they could get. So, Innocence III is consecration. He read this text, and this is how he took power. And he's the most, power-hungry one in the height of it all. This is what he read in his coronation. I have this day, use Jeremiah 1:10, I have this day set you over nations to root out, to pull down, destroy, and to throw down, and to build up in the plan. And for 3 decades, that's exactly what he did to Europe. He says, here I am, I'm anointed of God to tear everything down if I want, to root it all out, to rebuild it. In other words, anything I want to do, life and death, I have that power. So, he goes 3 decades, he's the vicar of Christ. The second way universities served the papacy was to provide rational theological construction of the Christian society. So they had heresies stemming from Greek philosophers, Muslim, Jewish, were spreading skepticism. They wanted canon law to deal with all these different things. So universities helped them sort out and define heresies and use the power of the church. The peak of rational reach, the church sends Thomas Aquinas to Paris, because this is where it really hits the rope at the University of Paris. They begin really to have the philosophy and the Q&A, and they start questioning the church, really. And they start wondering, like, wait a minute. Let's look at the philosophers. Let's look at this. Does the church really have this power? Well, the church put a short leash on this. They were going to deal with this. So they send this brilliant man, Thomas Aquinas, one of the tremendous thinkers of the church age with reason. The guy is a great, basically, diplomat. He's tremendous knowledge. He has tremendous temperament, kindness, and tremendous discipline, and he goes in. And he doesn't really attack these guys like the church is always ready for a war. He goes in and listens to these guys. And you know what? He listens to them and he examines their writing, all these Greek philosophies, these Muslim, philosophers, these Jewish philosophers. He examines them point by point. And what he does is he takes the church philosophy. The church has a philosophy. John 1 is a philosophy, and he examines their philosophies with the church writings, with the scriptures. And what does he do? He refutes some, and he reconciles others. He sees where they're coming from. So he looks at Aristotle, and he says, you know what? First cause. And he goes, I understand that. He goes, everything a cause. Aristotle would say, there's a cause to a cause, and you trace it back to the first cause of all causes. Well, that's creation. Well, that's fine. I don't mind that. Because that's a belief in God. Somebody made it. We have that argument today in universities. First cause. Intelligent design. Like, where did the cause happen from? The argument is, did it become from a rock that was a really hard rock floating in space? And one day that rock began to think? And here you are today, a thinking rock? I know I have a hard head, but I don't think I was a thinking rock. Or do we believe that first cause was intelligent design, that somebody designed all this? I have more logic to conclude that. But Aristotle started that kind of reasoning, so he would do what? He refuted some and reconcile some other. Aquinas made a clear distinction between philosophy and theology, reason and revelation. He said there's no contradiction between the two. They're both fountains of knowledge, both come from God. But reason is based on visible creation and can reach ideas and ideals with a vestibule of faith. But revelation is beyond that, to God himself. In other words, one is visible, but the revelation of God is what? Invisible. And it's how I see God himself, superior to reason, both in certainty and subject matter. So he saw that and he said, listen, I want to tell you there's both. There is reason and there is revelation, and they are complementary towards one another. So he answered these university questions brilliantly. He declared that reason can prove God's existence, like he said with Aristotle. However, full knowledge only comes from what? Revelation from God, the real origin. Aquinas was a brilliant thinker, a rational mind. He was completely loyal to the church in everything he related back to the church when the Pope was, he believed the Pope was what, Peter on earth. And he had absolute loyalty. That's one reason they sent him, because they knew this guy couldn't be swayed. He had absolute loyalty to the Pope. Okay? He believed that he was literally, Peter on earth. Even that submission to the Pope wasn't necessarily for salvation. He believed that. He believed that, listen, if you didn't submit to the Pope, then you probably weren't going to be saved. He was a product of environment and taught through fear and love. So all these are things that you have to look at, because you look at the brilliance of Aquinas and you say, you know what, how could he think that? But remember, even when we get down to Wycliffe, so much of everything is what you're taught and you don't think through. Sometimes what you're taught is an idea of fear and love. Like, I don't want to break away from that because I'm really afraid to break away from that. Like, where do you go when you break away from that? I mean, he was raised in the church. So he had loyalties that he was not going to break. He wouldn't even let them come into his mind. So he had to reconcile and conclude and refute things that came against it. And he did a brilliant job in Paris in doing that. So he is still read by most theologians and most people that study philosophy. I'll go on. He confirmed the sacraments, different things like that. We'll skip through. He strengthened penance, and even went farther than that. Like, the church realm was really crazy at this time, under Innocence. He claimed himself to be judge of the world. And it even went into the idea, and Augustine backed this, or Aquinas backed this, that you can start praying for the dead. In other words, it's almost like diversification of a business, I look at it like that. Here I have the Catholic Church, we need money. How can I get more money? How can I diverse out to a different field? Right? Can I build something else? Can we do something else? We are building cathedrals, we have universities, we're going into Muslim land. I got an idea. Let's go into heaven and hell. We can pray for the dead. We can take money for the dead. What a scam artist that is, man, right? $50 and your rotten dead uncle. Come on.
Shorten his purgatory.
Well, at least, he is wary of it, but he backed it. And money just raked in for this stuff. So they had this tremendous reach into all different things, but like everything they built, like the cathedrals, all this began to collapse. I mean, people had enough. They expanded so far out, like the Roman Empire did, that they began to collapse back in on themselves. And this is where you start having the demise of all these things. The growing number, of churchmen, he ended that whole chapter with the idea, still remember the apostles' testimony. There's one mediator between God and man. And it didn't say it's the Pope, right? I mean, they remember the Apostles' Creed, and the writings. So then we have the rise of the song of the Lady of Poverty. Everyone loves a lover. There's the song, right? And, Francis comes on the scene, and he's needed. There's so much lore on Francis. He kind of butchered Francis in this book, I thought. But so much of like anybody like Francis of Assisi is folklore. The beginning of the book is he goes to the Lady of Poverty, climbs a mountain. She's up there. She was in the Garden of Eden. This is crazy stuff, right? And when the garden fell, she went out and, she was with the monastic movement. But then when it became corrupt, she left and went up on a mountain, and Francis goes to her and becomes her lover, and he goes down and lives a life dedicated to her. Hell of a story, huh? I mean, there's other ones about Francis, and he doesn't write them, like about going to the Sultan at Palestine. He went to Palestine and meeting with him and, speaking to him about the gospel. And there's tons of stories about Francis, how amazing he was. In fact, we could show a Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon movie, which, has him walking out naked from his house. Here they said he left with a robe, and, most people don't walk around naked, especially when you're not supposed to. But he had a robe and a rope, and he walked out. That's in the book. In the movie, he walks out naked down the street and gives a vow of poverty. I don't know how much is trumped up about Francis, in folklore and church history. But he was an amazing guy. He was drawn, to poverty. his father had all kinds of ideals for him to be a knight. He goes into battle, one battle, he gets thrown in prison, he has a fever, and he thinks about his life, and he gets out, and he basically gives his life over to poverty. And the one title that Francis had was, that hit him like most people devoted to poverty is that foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of God has no place to lay his head. So he saw the abuses of the priests, he saw no pastoral care. The monastic movement had basically died out from ministering to people, so he takes off in that idea. Robert Grotesque, what a great name. Love that name. You like that name? You read it? Robert Grotesque. Great guy. Bishop of Lincoln. Declared the covetous and greed of immorality of the clergy, and the foundation of all this was the Roman court. So all this stuff wasn't new. It wasn't a new cry in the 10th century. He declared that the abuse, that poverty was the real channel of the monastic movement. It was real, the move that the church took that movement, all the monasteries, and basically they were corrupt as could be. But when they had these attacks come at them, they focused down, listen, we have this whole movement in monasteries, but they still lived in Rome with all the wealth and the jewels and everything else, but they had the monasteries to say, well, we have this branch over here, but leave us alone. So the Pope was the attack of all the wealth. So, like medieval Rome, you saw faith as a public, the cement of society, the denial of canon laws became treason, so they're trying to solidify the whole empire with faith. That would be treason to come against that. The question, like, you could look at these systems and condemn them, but, I wrote a little excerpt here, like, where are we today with this? And one of your questions is like, here's an extreme over here that brought order and civilization, that got abusive, but where are we today with abusiveness on the other side? Where's the church today in government? It's non-existent, right? There's another extreme, isn't it? It's not what was meant to be as far as, salt and light of Christ. So we can judge them, we need to judge ourselves too. So, like Roman Caesar worship, similar denial of baptism, baptized person in any revealed truth of the Christian faith. The Roman Caesar stuff was just like the system that they were propelling, that, you had to have this unity, and the Pope was going to bring that too, just like the Roman emperors. One of the things they started to do is deal with heretics. They wanted protection from society from these different things. The formation comes in of the Inquisition, if you read your books. They wanted to guard the church from this, and the question was to take a life to save other lives, to chop an arm off to save a body. So they wanted to protect their unity. And again, people are looking at this whole view of the church and seeing the corruption and bringing in attacks against it. They realized that if they had the attacks and let them go, they'd destroy their unity and what they built. So what are they doing? Defending themselves against those attacks. So they formed these different things. They formed the Inquisition, and to kill and execute and torture people, drive out the devil out of people. And when they did that, they opened the door to 7 others. In other words, they did these things, but they opened over 7 other problems. People saw these things. They saw the abuses, and they said, we're going to fight this. Second was the poor and the kingdom in this chapter, which is, where's the pure church? They wanted a pure church. Arnold the Abbot of Brescia, basically, the church's vice was to control the world. He urged the church to return to poverty, a secular to million. He wanted to divide it up and say, listen, you got to give the church to the state, or the government to the state. You got to take the church role of Christ to the church. You got to separate these things. And he wanted them to go back to the early church. Arnold, in 1139, turns people against their bishop. He's banished. He flees to France. He shows up in Rome, joins a movement. This is something I didn't know in history. Joins the movement against papal dominion in Rome. The Pope is out at the Second Crusade. He begins and they take over the government in Rome. And he starts a total secular government that lasted 10 years. And it was dedicated to separating the church and state. And the church was to have, instead of wealth, apostle poverty, basically. And the Council of Cardinals was a den of thieves, so they did away with that. That lasted 10 years. Hadrian IV places Rome under interdict, and the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa captures Arnold 1155, and he is burnt at the stake. Second voice comes up. It's a guy called Waldo. Remember Waldo?
Where's Waldo?
Waldo. He starts the Back to the Bible movement, one of the first ones, and they want to purify the church, and they believe in Scripture. So he's an early reformer in a sense, and he goes independent and poverty, and he really has a movement here. But one thing they lacked, because they go into penance and poverty, and basically he lacks the real grace of the later reformers. In other words, it's more of a work system, and that's Waldo and his heresies. He goes to Rome. The Pope sees him. He loves the guy, and he basically tells Waldo, he goes, listen, you can go and preach, but only if the bishops let you do it. In other words, go out. It's like you saying, go back to Massachusetts. If the governor in Massachusetts lets you do what you want to do, fine. If he doesn't, don't do it. Well, no bishop's going to let him do it, so he has nobody. So he says, you know what, I'm going to preach. So he starts the Waldians, whatever, they follow him, and he gets a huge movement in France. And basically he preaches poverty, and he preaches the gospel. He's in the Word of God. So he's huge in that aspect, and they become something else. The third heresy and dissenting movement was the Cathari, and they called themselves the pure ones, and they were just a Gnostic heresy that repackaged itself in dualism, good and evil, and spirit and matter. They hated matter, everything was spirit. The Pope basically went at them to do 3 different ways to get rid of them. They were the more threat of any of these different movements. This one was, he sent Dominicans to preach to them, the first one, the kind one, to return to the truth. His second option was crusade, to crush the resistance, the hard resistance, and deal with them. The third one was the Inquisition, to clean out the heresy. He uses all 3. He sends the Dominicans, and, basically he sends Dominic. Basically, he's the rise of the Dominicans. My wife's maiden name, Dominic Guzman, is the first Dominican. And he goes into these people. He begins to preach. But what he sees is that the way the Rome sent him and the emissaries, they all come in wealth and pomp. And so the heretics basically look at them, these guys, and they say, listen, this is definitely false religion. So they don't receive any of them. So Dominic gets brilliant. He goes, the reason they're seeing and not responding is because of the way you're coming. If you let me come in poverty and preach to them, they'll listen to me. So he does that. He puts on the robe of poverty, he goes barefoot, and he preaches to them. He starts to have success. It's too slow. 2 years go by, and innocence is like, I had enough of this. It's time for tough love. He takes northern France, who wants to conquer southern France anyway, but the Pope keeps order, and he lets them come down and rape and pillage and destroy these people completely. The Inquisition sent in, because they're hounded, the guys in the hills, whatever, they go in, they hounded everybody else that is a Catharthy, and they killed them, and so that's basically annihilated under innocence. But the Dominicans, basically, this guy, Dominic Guzman, he forms the Dominicans because he really sees he has success preaching. He takes a vow of poverty, he starts the Dominican order, and he gets sanctioned by the Pope in 1220. And that's a huge thing, and they're beggars. I don't know where anybody gets begging out of the Bible. I know he sent them without coat, and purse, but there's laws of hospitality in the Middle East, and have been to foreign countries. Even in third world, they have laws of hospitality, right? They're bigger than our country, really, don't they? And so they went, and when they were received, they were clothed and fed. I don't see any Bible sanction to beg, but Dominicans went begging. They went as friars to distinguish themselves from monks, which means they weren't monasteristic. They went amongst the people with poverty. and the monasteries went up on their hills, so they had an outreach. And they revived the idea of Gregory. Remember the monastic movement? Gregory had them going out and feeding the poor. They kind of stopped that. The Dominicans take it over. So, 1215 was that crusade down from northern France, basically destroyed these people. The Inquisition enters in, and that's, seen as just a disregard of justice. They basically just tortured and killed people. They wouldn't kill people in the sense that they would kill them, but they'd turn them over to the state after they found them guilty and let the state kill them. But they would torture people. But they would make them confess. There's no justice in that. They had no lawyers. They couldn't confront their accusers. So they go on and on with that. So, yeah, this happens, and this is a brutal part of church history in the same way. And that whole thing, this end of the heresy things, I mean, Mary Betty, this thing resurfaces in history. If you saw the part where it said Mary Betty Aker, this whole heresy of dualism, is dead all the way to the church Christian Science movement. But that reinstates, they believe that matter was completely evil, so they believe the same beliefs to a degree that this heresy believes. So these things all repackage themselves as the idea here. So you see these heresies, they're not old. The ones that are out today, they're not new. They're old. The Inquisition survives. The Ministry of Healing rose 85 miles to the north after this, because the Inquisition, these guys can only torture. Francis comes on the scene and he promotes healing, with his vow of poverty, and he founds the Franciscans. And amazing story. You can read in your book, The Cover Time, again, a lot what I told you about his life, his vow of poverty. He had a vision for the world too. He goes to the east. He talks to the Sultan of Egypt. He goes to the Holy Lands. He ends up back in Rome. And when he gets back in Rome, his following is so great that they basically want to organize it. And Francis wasn't about organization. He was like, I want to go preach to the birds in the fields. I want to have a vow of poverty. I don't want all this administration crap. I identify with the guy. So the guy's like that. But they had so many people they had to organize. And so he basically says, I don't want to do this anymore. And he bows out, and he gets an appointed cardinal who admired him, and he takes over the whole movement, and the Franciscan order begins to emerge. And it's, given sanction by the Pope. The Pope sanctions it. And just like the Dominicans, they have a vow of poverty, and they're the lesser brethren, and they go on to this day. Francis basically saw his ideals. You don't see this about Francis, but basically what it ends up the book with Francis, he sees his ideals basically changed. And, worldly power comes in, and he dies in Assisi in 1226 in humility and song. And, he was a great, great mover in the church. Some people say he saved the church. The Pope, when he saw Francis, said, I had a dream that Francis would save the church. That's one of the legends I remember from church history before. But really, he paints a sounder picture of Francis, that, Francis had a great ideal. People flocked to the ideal. He lived it. But then he didn't want all the fame, just like Gregory didn't want it. And he ends up giving up his whole movement back to the church. So, we have the complete poverty, extreme views, and they would say they're indispensable to the true church. And this is the challenge that is always today even when we see mega, the challenge was this, is that poverty versus extreme wealth. Right? It's still a challenge in this church, in any church, right? What do you have? Where's the clash? How much do you hoard? So this was a huge, huge challenge to the church. They saw the tremendous wealth, they saw the poverty. And what's the real church? And so now we see sleeping men. 22 was sleeping men in the law of necessity. And this is 14th century Pope Boniface VIII. He starts the 1300, the 14th century with his new millennium. I guess this happened in 1975. I don't follow recent church history that much, but John Paul in 1975 did the same thing as he did in 1300. He opened the door for basically the gift of plenary indulgence. In other words, everybody that came to Rome at that time for that year and visited St. Peter's and all this stuff was given complete indulgence and pardon of sins. I guess it happened in 1975 again, the only time since that time. But throngs of people came to Rome both times, and you know what? Money came into Rome. Tons of money came into Rome, just like tourism. And they raked in money, and you know what? He thought, man, he was like, he came after Innocence the Great. He thought he had all power on earth. He said, you know what? I am in the power seat. This will never be challenged. I can excommunicate you, your whole nation, your family, condemn you, send the Inquisition. You know, I have absolute power. Absolute power kind of corrupts. And so he started 3 years later, he'd be completely humiliated. This whole idea of the Catholic Church and the Empire was clashing. Emperors were like, you know what, I don't want to put up with this anymore. The power of the Church to bring order was a fading idea. The nations were beginning to emerge. Money, power, taxes, churches always want their cut. So like anybody, you're starting to say, do I need these people? You know, I got an army, I'm 2,000 miles away. Do I need this kind of, you know, hostility? It came to a head with England and France, with Philip and Edward. They were a new breed of monarch. They were warring with each other. They needed money. The church always taxed the state, so you know what they did? They needed money. They wanted to tax the church. You know what Boniface did? Said, can't do that. I'm going to excommunicate you. I'm going to do whatever, you know what I mean? And they were kind of like, you know what? We're going to do what we want. You know, we're not going to be threatened by you. So they played tit for tat. And Edward in England, he couldn't embargo a lot like Philip maybe could, but he basically said, you know what? If you guys don't pay, you know what? I'll take your land. And I'll confiscate it. So, you know what? It's either pay or we're taking everything. Philip answered, he embargoed all the gold and jewels from his lands, depriving the papacy of a major income source. So all of a sudden, this huge stream of revenue from two of the greatest nations in his empire say, we ain't giving you anything more. You got to pay taxes. And Boniface, you know, basically gives in and says, I'm sorry. And, you know, he backs down. And so once you back down, you're going to back up. And so they take it all away. And so they had this huge victory. So Philip declares after this, he goes right at the neck of this whole strangle. He goes, the Pope has no temporal power on earth. Boniface gets completely crazy. I mean, he just used, this is the greatest extreme, they say, of papal power in history. He declares every human being is subject to the Roman pontiff. And so, like, he's going to basically make a unum sanction. It's just like complete, like excommunication, interdict, everything included to this nation, to this person, and you know, they basically say, we don't care, and they strike back. Philip strikes back by having him disposed. Because his election's illegal, plus the testimony of heresy. He's after him in the sense of heresy and simony and immorality. A lot of this was true. He looks at him and says, you know what, you're going to come at me, I'm going to come at you. He gets a lawyer, and lawyers are all corrupt anyway, to lie and cheat. So he's like 20 charges against the Pope. And armed with French churchmen and nobles, he comes into Rome, he comes towards Rome to take the Pope back to France for trial. So you know what? They back Philip because he has swords and the Pope has words. And in 86, you know, they come in and they take him, and they basically keep him hostage for a little bit. Locals free him, but he is so humiliated when he knows what's happening that he's 86 years old, and he just like drops dead real soon, you know, and the whole thing's over. So this was a direct attack by the state to the Pope. So all of a sudden the power from Innocence is diminishing. So Europeans no longer accept the Pope's interference in political matters. King's power in his own country was generally accepted, so the power strengthens. The attack on the Pope still was resented because, you know what, people don't like you messing with the Pope. People still, like I said, remember when I said they would go against the Pope and everybody would rise up and say, you can't do that. They'd make the noble humble. And people still had resentment. People still have loyalties to the Catholic Church. They're huge. Right? Despite all the abominations and all the scandals, people still, you see the Pope, you're going to see 1 million people there, right? They don't care. Stronger in this age, I'm sure. So no matter what they did, people were still not very happy with, he was the Holy Father. So, but this is beginning to distinguish this order and this religious authority. And Boniface dies after a short reign. So we go on from there, and we close that chapter. The captivity of the Holy Father. Clement marks a 72-year period called by church history. This 72-year period basically is called the Babylonian captivity, the papacy. What happens in this period is what happens is the French basically in this whole attack towards the emperor, the Council of Cardinals is predominantly French. They elect a French pope, and he basically, with the king, remember this is hand and scratch back, he removes the whole papacy from Rome to Avignon in France, and it's real close to the emperor, right on the border of the emperor's realm. So he wants to be there to be at the call of the Emperor of France. Well, this is a 72-year sought captivity of the Holy Father, and we're supposed to be in Rome. The Catholic Church, that's where Peter was, that's where Paul was. So he's captive by his own will in France. The rest of Europe didn't like this at all, the Germans especially. 6 popes would come after him in succession and live in France for 72 years. And this is the most embarrassing time of the popes, so I'll just summarize it. What happens is they finally get the French pope to capitulate, and basically they elect an Italian pope in Rome. Well, what happens with the Italian pope? He gets the power. Now he's going to be dictator to the French. He's not going to do what the French want. So they dispose him. They elect another pope. Whether they make another whole council of cardinals. There's 2 councils now, and they elect the French pope. Now they have 2 popes. So now there's a whole war on who's the real pope stand up. So now they go through a whole craziness of they finally elect a 3rd pope. And all this is insane, in the sense that they're watching this thing go on, and the reformers are getting steam because they're saying, look how corrupt the church is. Which is what your underwear's right on the line. And anybody with a brain who's educated can see the idea. So the great papal schism becomes after this. Urban rules from Rome, Clement from Avignon. A new pope is elected in 1409 at the Council of Nicaea, elected a 3rd man, exiled the 4th. But neither popes accepted the election of the new pope. So they have 3 popes fighting, right? 1414, the Holy Emperor assembles in Constance, Germany. National alignment to power. Germans, Italian, French vote. Spanish 1 vote. All 3 step down finally, all 3 popes. They elect a new pope, Martin V, ending the Great Schism. So it goes to this whole thing from the 72-year Babylonian captivity in the sense of the pope in France, the 3 popes, now back to 1 pope. And necessity triumphs in this. Okay? So now we come into the most corrupt time in the sense these popes become super, super corrupt. He has power, basically. He wants to make money for his family. He's immoral. Basically, this is being seen by all the corruption and the decadency of the Roman papacy. Corruption rises. He wants to be Caesar or Peter, becomes whatever in his mind. Rodriguez Burgo, Alexander VI. He's immoral, he's obsessive, personal wealth. And the council that, basically there's a council that would arise and that would be remembered and be used in the Reformation, but what happens during this period, just to sum up the period, is they want to start a council, and this is what some of those earlier thinkers, to basically rein in the power of the Pope. And they wanted to have, it's almost like a presbyteros in church government, to rein in a bishop. They wanted somebody to be able to take and remove the Pope. And so this wasn't thought of, the Pope put this down, but a council, because of the schism, comes to power. The council basically ends the schism, elects the new fourth Pope, but as soon as the Pope gets in, guess what he does? He destroys the council. Except the only verdict he goes with is the one that put him in power. But every other decree to basically maintain some kind of order and civility in the papacy, he throws out all their rulings. You like the corruption in that? I love you when I need you. So this sets up the idea of the Reformed. And we're almost done here, guys. Give me a minute. We're on our last chapter. 23. Judgment in the process of time. So we have a system, is the human nature turns the good thing to the... All these things, the captivity of the Great Schism, Avignon, the thing, puts the reformers in order. The council movement has no reforms set forth within the church. So basically we're looking at the idea that the church can't reform itself. The idea of the Pope, like I said before, died really slowly. People still wanted the church father. But Europeans could not free themselves from the Pope. They couldn't do it because of people's loyalties and tradition. Even all the corruption, the diabolical, the self-interest, couldn't fuel it, couldn't stop it. But then you have the rise of the beginning of the reformers before the great Reformation of Luther, which is the rise of Wycliffe and Huss. English is the Oxford zealot. Basically, he becomes the head of Oxford. He begins to Q&A all the different aspects of church government and canon law. He looks at what's happening outside in the church, and he's appalled, like anybody would be, who thinks of all the corruption. And, he begins to preach against it. He begins to preach against the papacy. He says, who's the Pope? Where do you see that? How is Peter, the vicar, how is he related to vicar? Or to the Pope, because of, I can't say it. How is Peter and the Pope related in power? Why don't we call the Bishop of Jerusalem? Christ died in Jerusalem, right? Peter died in Rome. Why are we making him the Pope? Why don't we make that guy the Pope? Christ is bigger than Peter, right? He looks at the reason like this doesn't make any sense. And he looks at the idea the Scripture should make sense. So in all canon law, he looks at the different options. And yet, at the end of his life, he still holds on to different ideas of purgatory and different things. So not everything changes in one man. His ideas, basically, he is pulled out of the Oxford University, because eventually, basically this is all claimed to be heresy. The Pope watches these universities, even in England. And he is forced into retirement. He dies basically peaceful at his own abbey. And the end of his life goes on. The next one is John Huss. And he takes the teaching of Wycliffe. And basically they're brought back and forth from Oxford to Prague in Czechoslovakia. This is the Bohemian, for you Bohemians out there, Freddie. This is the Bohemian revival in a sense. Huss gets this. He is in school at the University of Prague. They are going back and forth in knowledge and students from Oxford to Prague, Czechoslovakia, because of intermarryings of the church. The King of England had married one of the princesses of Czechoslovakia, Bohemian Empire. So there was a relationship there. They traveled back and forth, scholars. So somehow Wycliffe's teachings get in the hand of Huss, and Huss takes off on them. And he agrees, looking at the Pope, and he agrees with the idea of this whole idea of corruption. And he begins to take this idea of reform to the streets and to his preaching. Again, he is seen as a heretic. They see that the Pope is basically an antichrist. They look at just a common reason. Christ is the truth, and the Pope is pure falsehood, was one of the statements. Christ lived in poverty, the Pope labors for worldly influence and power and wealth. Christ refused temporal dominion, the Pope seeks it. So all these just simple ideas in logic, in Q&A, people just said, yeah, you're right. And, this began to rise as a movement. And they started to go from reformer to Protestant. They, like the Protestants, which would go with protest. So, the ancient view of the church became more popular, that we triumph in heaven, we're militant on the earth, and then we're asleep in purgatory. Two realms the church would enter into with its people. They challenged them to the belief of the medieval church. The pardoning of indulgences they looked at, absolutions of sin, pilgrimages, worship of images, adoration of the saints, the treasury of their merit laid up for reserve for the Pope. They challenged all these things and said, what, these are not in the Scriptures, because Huss and Wycliffe, and Wycliffe would translate the Bible into English, they basically said these things aren't in Scripture. They looked at the New Testament as the full authority and the judge for all these things. They attacked, and Wycliffe, this really got him the fury of heresy to stop this preaching, is he looked at transubstantiation like Zwingli, like it was a remembrance. Where do you get off its, turned into the blood and body of Christ. So he attacked that, and that was like complete heresy to the church. So he only survived because he had powerful friends, and he was put in exile, and that's about it. So the Archbishop of Canterbury did with him. But before leaving, in the translation of the Bible, before leaving this whole idea of Oxford, he'd already had a movement going, translating the Bible, but he also had disciples, and they put on the same garb of Assisi, and they became poor priests on the road. And this was really, the idea of getting into Calvin on that. They became poor, basically clergy, traveling the countryside and preaching the Bible. And that's what they did, and that's what his disciples did. And then, again, Wycliffe dies in 1385, and again, Huss takes that over. But Huss' sermons, began to preach and produce more effect in Bohemia even than England. Riots in the street broke out for Huss and against Huss. I mean, that's how you have it in a college campus, right? You take one side, people are for you. Take another side, people are against you, especially on extreme. You can go on abortion, right? You can go on one side, preach people are, hey, we're for life, and the other side, we're for choice. And that's what they did with this whole idea. Huss was preaching against the papacy. Some were for it, and some, were definitely against it. So Huss is excommunicated. He flees to the southern Bohemia, hunts some deer down there, and, the church follows him eventually. He found himself, he's called back, basically, the Council of Constance is being assembled. That's one of the councils I didn't mention, but that's the council that dealt with the papacy issue of the four popes in Germany. That's going to happen, so he's called back to Prague, to the Czech emperor, before that conference, to go to that conference. A nice invite, but when he gets there, guess who's waiting for him? The Inquisition. So he goes and he meets the Inquisition, and of course they want him to recant. And I'm sure he wanted to recant, but he couldn't recant because he couldn't recant for all his disciples the truth he preached. So it's one of the saddest, most beautiful parts of this book is Huss's last words and, his defense of his faith. And, he goes to his death, and he's burned alive. His church, he founds a church, and they basically, two radical groups come off, a moderate group that just basically was all about the communion. They wanted to drink the communion. It wasn't, they cared about transubstantiation, but they didn't want the Eucharist. They wanted the cup and the blood. But then there was a more radical group which survived, and they were called the Unity of the Brotherhood. And they were more on the radical views of Huss. And they survived, though there were many wars and different things. But they survived all the way to Luther. Basically, the 99 Theses and began the Lutheran Church and the Protestant Reformation. And Huss was probably the biggest impetus for Luther and Wycliffe, taking off of Huss's writings, which you'll find out in the Reformation when we start the next phase with Rich, that really prompted Luther to have the courage to step into the arena, basically. Because he looked at the same thing that could happen to Huss, right? Only a few years earlier, he's burned for preaching. So these were like perilous days but glorious days, but that's the Middle Ages and that's the end of it.